With that, we'd like to invite Kirsten Lloyd, Associate at Booz Allen Hamilton, to speak. Thank you very much.
Try not to knock this over. We'll see how that goes. But thank you all for having me here tonight. My name is Kirsten Lloyd. I'm an associate with Booz Allen Hamilton, and I work in our strategic innovation function for our machine intelligence strategy capability. So I'm here tonight to talk to you about a paper that we co-authored with the Center for Strategic and International Studies last month, a national machine intelligence strategy for the United States. So basically, what inspired us to really think about writing this paper is kind of the intersection of our work that we do with both federal and commercial clients, specifically in the MI realm. The work that we do working to help make our armed forces more resilient, capable, and provide them better insights into their threat environments has really helped us to stop and think more broadly around the opportunities and threats posed by machine intelligence-enabled technologies. It's interesting, when I was reviewing my notes from this past month when we were going to be giving this talk, it happened kind of on the heels of the first fatality from Uber's self-driving car program. And recently, that's sort of been overshadowed by everything that's happened with Facebook's misuse of 87 million users' data in the wake of the Cambridge Analytica scandal. So I think it's really interesting, these types of high-profile missteps that seem to happen every single day really shed light on some of the risks posed by this type of technology. A lot of what we hear, especially from our clients, is kind of this Terminator-like narrative and how that's what people are mostly concerned about, and that's why we actually talk oftentimes about machine intelligence rather than using the term AI with our clients to try and dispel some of this. But there are a lot more subtle and pernicious threats, kind of like this whole idea of the impact of this type of technology on our democratic institutions that we are thinking about today. But I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, because I think that we really think that this technology has the potential to be super transformative, and we shouldn't let these risks outweigh the benefits. So that's how we came to partner with CSIS to develop this paper. The United States is, in my personal opinion, somewhat far behind in terms of thinking about a comprehensive national strategy for machine intelligence. Some of our allies, so the United Kingdom, France, Canada, have all published their own national strategies, investment plans, et cetera, for machine intelligence. Another country that's been super bullish about this is China, which has announced a multi-billion-dollar investment initiative funding for MI programs, research, et cetera. And whereas we have been somewhat quiet about that in terms of thinking through a strategy. The Obama administration conducted a study through the Office of National Science and Technology Policy prior to his departure, but the Trump administration really has been silent on this and have proposed cutting funding to agencies like the National Science Foundation by 10%. So the reason that we authored this paper was to sort of provide some food for thought for these regulators and policymakers to try and think about how we can help enable a regulatory environment that fosters the spirit of innovation while also ensuring that the technology is developed in a manner that is standard and aligned to American values. So with that being said, we wrote the paper with two main goals in mind. So the first is to really communicate the necessity of safe and responsible development of this technology. So this isn't necessarily, I was talking to someone earlier, this isn't necessarily going out and using data and just trying to play around with things and say, okay, just because I have access to this information, should I do X, Y, and Z? There should be pause before big tech companies are able to use their access to data sets to help create solutions. We want to ensure that we're developing it in a safe and responsible manner that is aligned to our values. That will help to ensure that the technology that's developed is beneficial to the most people, and ultimately, down the line, we're going to start seeing things like exacerbation of inequality. Obviously the jobs loss narrative is another thing that, we really want to dispel. It's not, I think it's interesting, the GeoInt conference that's happening right now, I believe today there was a quote that they would need to hire an additional 8 million analysts to be able to analyze all of the data coming in from all of the different sensors, full motion video, drones, etc. Obviously, we don't have the funding or manpower to train that many people. But with that in mind, we want to help perpetuate a narrative that machine intelligence is going to be something that is going to help make our lives easier. I'm sure every single person in this room can think of 5 to 10 things that you would love to have taken off your plate, the super easy computational task that you perform every day. Why not delegate that to a machine so that you can spend your time thinking and using your critical thinking skills to do what is more interesting and better suited for a human. So the second thing that we decided that it was super important to write this paper was to help continue establishing US leadership and reinforcing our innovation base to help promote the development of this type of technology. We don't want to fall behind to China. There's been a lot of published research and articles about a potential new MI arms race, and we don't really want to be falling behind because the impact of that, you can think about it across all areas of society. From a national security perspective, again, not going down the Terminator AI robot scenario, but there are things that we should be thinking about, and there's proactive steps that we can be taking to ensure that this doesn't happen. So with that, I'll walk through some of the paper recommendations. It's a pretty long paper, like 55 pages. It's on our website and on CSIS's website, so I'd encourage you to check that out on our machine intelligence page. The first recommendation is that we really need to invest in continued research and development of the technology, and that is through government-funded programs. So as I mentioned earlier, China has a multi-billion-dollar investment initiative over the next, I guess it's now 12 years, to help make them the global leader of MI by 2030. 2 cities in China alone have announced $7.7 billion worth of investment. And as I said earlier, in 2015, government funding on MI-related research in the US was only $1.1 billion. So that's a pretty big gap that we want to close. So the first thing that we can think about here, we really can't just be relying on the private sector to fund this technology. If you hearken back to the past, we can think about, we believe that this is going to be a technology that is ubiquitous as the internet going forward. So you can think about the funding of the ARPANET, that was all through DARPA funding. Obviously, at this point, we are never going to catch up with your Google, Facebook, Amazon, et cetera, in terms of the innovation in the private sector. However, there is things that the government can do in terms of allocating more research and funding dollars to agencies like the NSF, to research institutions to help push and forward the development of this technology. So our current spending levels as it stands are about a half to a quarter of what they should be based on our research. And another thing, as I mentioned earlier, this is something that we really need to step up to help ensure that our forces, from a national security perspective, are keeping pace with that of our allies and of our competitors. The next recommendation is around developing the workforce for the machine intelligence age. This one is one that I think is one of the more interesting recommendations and one of the more interesting areas to look at. Our education strategy really needs to be one that helps to foster the development of a digitally literate workforce going forward. A study by Element AI, which is a Canadian-based research firm, found in the last year that there are only about 22,000 people in the world who are actually trained and able to do the type of machine intelligence research that's needed to really advance this technology. Now that number is double from the previous year, but if we continue to educate and have programs in place that we have now, we are not going to have the workforce of the future to be able to work alongside these machines. One of the most interesting things, at least from my own perspective, is that this is not meaning I talk about this in terms of a digitally literate workforce. I'm not saying that everybody needs to be able to code. One of the most important things is going to be, stressing the importance of critical thinking and soft skills and liberal arts education to help make sure that art workers are prepared to perform those higher cognitive tasks. I am a Latin American Studies and History double major, and here I am today talking to you about this. So I believe really in the power of a liberal arts degree, and I think that it's going to be something going forward that is really going to need to be emphasized. So stepping away kind of from the innovation base and thinking about shifting the schooling system that we have in the United States, we also want the Department of Education to really convene a working group to look at the skills needed for the future. And this is going to require some changing curriculum. And it's really interesting. There was an article in the New York Times, I think just last week, that actually talked about the shifting paradigm of education in the US to one that is now really focused on teaching towards standardized tests, whereas in China, actually, if you go into the classrooms, they have really shifted the way of thinking so that they are enabling their students to really think creatively and help foster this spirit of innovation. And this is something that, again, we really are going to need to change in the way that we are educating our students. Now, to take a step back from there, we also need to think about how we're going to retrain and upskill our existing workforce. Jobs of the future will change. There is going to need to be social safety nets for people whose jobs shift because of machine intelligence enabled technologies. And again, I'm not saying that there's going to be entire industries wiped out, but there are going to be shifts in the nature of the workforce. And we at Booz Allen actually are very committed to this. And I believe it's next month, so it's May 8th, we have a deep learning training program that is geared towards very, not advanced, very basic people. But we have topics such as demystifying deep learning for executives that's really aimed at helping to upskill and educate people already in the workforce around these technologies. And Jason, who will be speaking after me from NVIDIA, we actually have a really great, a very strong relationship with NVIDIA, and we are the first federally focused consulting firm that is certified to give NVIDIA's deep learning training. So I'd encourage you to look at our website for more information about that. So the next recommendation, stepping sort of away from the education piece, is around creating a flexible and open data ecosystem to help enable machine intelligence technology. And I believe someone earlier was talking about how the government really sits on this rich data set. There are initiatives to open these data sets to help enable machine intelligence technology, but the government really can be doing more to help expand access to all this different type of data to allow the training of MI so that we can all, again, benefit from it. And this is something that we really need to work with the private sector to help understand ways to share data in a way that protects privacy. I'll get a little bit further into risk management strategies later, but again, I think that this Facebook example has really shed light on how much information that we are all willing to give up for a free service, but then obviously are very concerned about when that data is not necessarily being protected in a manner that we either thought it was or maybe we didn't really give a thought to when we gave up the data. So the next piece, which kind of plays into this, is really creating thoughtful public policy to spur machine intelligence adoption and reduce barriers. So a lot of the ways that our federal government systems are configured are in a way that does not necessarily support machine intelligence technology. So if you think about the building blocks of MI, data, computing power, and then research and training neural networks using deep learning, et cetera, the infrastructure isn't configured in a way to support. And part of this is due to the really uncertain regulatory and policy landscape. I think the Uber example is a perfect, it sheds light on this. There was a quote from one of the sheriffs after the fact that they would not be holding Uber liable for the death of the pedestrian, but that was actually contradictory to the law on Arizona's books around who would be held liable. So there really does need to be some thought, and policymakers they do have the opportunity to sit and think about this to try and help shed some light and guidance on what should be done going forward to ensure that there is certainty in the policy landscape. In the last week, a group of researchers from, I believe it's AI Now, including Microsoft's own Kate Crawford, published an algorithmic impact assessment framework for public institutions when considering machine intelligence adoption and implementation. So actually ensuring and testing when they're going to apply an algorithm for some type of public use that it's going to be explainable, it's trustable, et cetera. So really, this is still obviously a nascent area, it's still coalescing, but there are more proactive steps that policymakers can be taking going forward to ensure that we're adopting it in a safe and responsible way. So the next piece, the next recommendation, and I know I'm nearing my end of time, but it's to really develop proactive strategies to manage risks. So I think right now we're really acting in a reactive manner. I think that this, again, not to just harp on the Facebook thing, but it's really called to light that we're thinking about this from a reactive way. And I know that in the UK, the House of Lords Committee on AI has called for, I believe it was even in the last week, 5 ethical principles to guide the regulation of AI. So they've taken a pretty strong stance, and from that particular governing body have released 5 principles that they believe should be guiding the way that AI is implemented. The government obviously has an important position in leading the development of safety and ethics and control standards for machine intelligence. And we at Booz Allen actually, I was involved in writing this paper that we have on our website, and it's an ethical risk assessment framework for machine intelligence implementations that kind of looks at the liability piece, understanding who is going to be impacted, the range of impact in terms of population. Is it just your customers? Is it all citizens? What type of impact is going to be felt? Is it a minor annoyance? Is it something that's going to cause people physical harm? These are all questions that need to be at the forefront of policymakers and people actually doing the developing going forward. And then the final piece and the final recommendation in the paper is really to help reestablish U.S. leadership and development of tech and governance around the world through our strategic partnerships. So we shouldn't just be letting, when something like this happens, obviously Mark Zuckerberg came down and testified, but it shouldn't just be the UK's governing body that is putting out these standards and taking a strong stance in pushing forward the envelope in terms of developing ethical principles and policy. We really want to be there at the forefront so that we can ensure that the technology is developed in a manner that is aligned to our own standards. But that is basically, those are all the recommendations in the paper in 20 minutes, but I would really encourage you to take the read of the full 55-page document, and with that, I will turn it over to you guys for questions. Yeah, in the back. Sure. No, I mean, I definitely think that that's part of the reason why people have taken kind of a risk-averse approach in terms of adding that extra layer of regulation. But I think that if you step back and think about all of the issues and accidents that have happened up till this point, I mean, that shows that it can't just be the private companies self-regulating. Another one in the back? Mm-hmm. So I would think that runs a little bit counter to competition. Yeah. And I mean, but that's part of the problem that you're seeing, right? So, I mean, you can look at even the talent war for this. It's OpenAI, because it's a nonprofit, just had to publish or disclose the salary and earnings. They pay their top 3 researchers at a nonprofit upwards of $1 million a year. So there's a competition for talent, and and all of them have been quoted saying, I could go work for this big private company making 4 or 5 times that. I'm 2 years out of school type thing. So, I mean, there's that element in terms of competing for the people that can actually do this research, and then there's also kind of a stifling of innovation. There are big tech companies like Google are constantly buying up these smaller companies just to sort of make sure that they have, if it's a if it's a specific capability, not necessarily stifling the innovation, but from a competitive perspective, trying to consolidate their own hold on power and the access to the technology. So it's hard right now, but it's something that it's gone on unregulated and unguided for too long that I think it's time. Yeah. So there are global governance standards and treaties that many countries, and I honestly believe the U.S. is one of them, has signed on to say that we will not develop lethal autonomous weapons system. No one is proposing human out-of-the-loop weapons at this point. We don't necessarily get into that in this piece, but I believe in our ethics paper we do talk about that type of issue.
Because now I have a question. First of all, really enjoyed your summary. Can't wait to read the entire paper. Can you briefly talk about, you said something very interesting that, changing the education style for kids. Many of us here work with Hour of Code and teach kids sort of imperative programming paradigms. Can you talk a little bit about what that shift would be in terms of teaching kids with machine learning focus?
Yeah, I think so. Some of this is going to be the problem, again, that I was talking about in terms of the talent gap and not having enough people to be able to do this, and then also the people that are. We can't all do what Uber did with its self-driving program and just hire all of Carnegie Mellon's computer science department. So there's going to have to be, even just thinking about using technology to be able to offer more virtual options to get these experts to be able to teach children, things like that. And that's one of the main recommendations, is that we really do think that the Department of Education should convene a working group to stand up and look at this, to help think about a way that this is something that is starting not in, I don't know, I'm trying to remember when I had to take like a computer class. It wasn't until middle or high school at that point, right? And that's not going to be something that's going to be for the future. It needs to change. There's one more question here. I don't know how much time.
Thanks for your presentation. I think machine language intelligence is great, but there are 2 points. One is now as platform government. I think that for government, they are to do something for many purposes that will be good. But currently, PPP, a couple of things, public-private partnership, that's very extremely abuse and very fraud and crime. So I hope that you people focus on very things rather than try to use the government money. And the issue is putting money is penniless. It's not true. The public debt is extremely high now, $1 trillion. And second thing is that on the contrary, government performance is very poor in terms of this high tech. If you want to communicate with government, there's limited to a few characters. So the basic internet is that your book will be hundreds of pages. So if the government cannot compete with private, and if you get a lot of government money, government do nothing. So I think if you can help the government, ask them to do very little things, but little input that can improve another efficiency.
Yeah, I think the point of this is we really want to encourage more collaboration between the government and private sector to help ensure that our dollars are going towards programs that are advancing the technology. But thank you for your question.